everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, Transition Planning for Dependent and Delinquent Youth with Disabilities. This is the first webinar in a new series we are hosting with the Juvenile Law Center and the Center for Excellence in Advocacy. Before we get started, I want to review a few housekeeping items with you and let you know how you can participate in today's session. Here you'll see a screenshot to show you an example of the attendee interface. You should see something like this on your own computer or desktop in the right-hand corner. You also may see something that looks like this, depending on whether you launched the webinar through your internet browser or through your desktop. You have joined today's webinar by listening through your computer speaker system by default. If you would like to call in using the phone, you can locate the audio pane and select Use Telephone, and the dial-in information and access code will then be displayed. Your active participation is important throughout this session. Right now, I have everyone on mute to avoid background noises that may distract you from listening to the webinar. If you call in instead of using the default computer speaker system, you'll have to manually mute yourself, and instructions on how to do so will appear once you call in. You will notice a chat box at the bottom of your viewer plane. If at any point during the presentation you have a question for the presenter or for me as the organizer, you can feel free to send that question through the chat box, and you should have the option to select who your question in chat goes through. So throughout the presentation, someone will be monitoring that chat functionality. However, due to the fact that today's webinar is only an hour in length, we will try and limit questions asked throughout the presentation. We will be monitoring the questions and saving them, and any questions that come through that we're not able to address, we will have the presenters address after the training. Additionally, there may be some questions that you have that we are unable to answer, mainly systems-based questions or tech-related questions. If you have any such questions, you can feel free to call this line. As a part of monitoring attentiveness during the training, which is required as a requirement for continuing education credit, we are able to see who is actively participating and listening into the presentation, so we do want to let everyone know that that is an aspect of today's training as well. I would also like to draw your attention to the materials section. You should see that in your side viewer plane as well. If you click the plus sign, it should expand, and you should see the materials provided for today's training, which include a PowerPoint link as well as some materials that have been provided by the presenters. You will also see a link to the evaluation in your materials. Please be sure to open that link and save it to your internet browser so you can complete the evaluation once the webinar is finished. I did want to make a note about continuing education credit. We are approved to provide credit for attorneys licensed in PA and social workers, licensed professional counselors, and marriage and family therapists. In order to qualify for credit, you must attend and be fully attentive throughout the entire webinar and complete an evaluation. The evaluation, again, is included in your materials. If you are taking this course for CEU credit, a reminder that you must at least attend 2 sessions before you can qualify for credit. If you are licensed in another state or you need continuing education credit for another profession, we can give you a general certificate, then you can then submit to your respective board. If that's something that you need, please indicate so on your evaluation. One final point is that, again, the evaluation is required for all attendees who are taking this course for continuing education credit or would like a general certificate of continuing education. This evaluation, again, is included in your materials and will be sent to you after the training. The evaluation will remain open for about 5 days following the training. So I would now like to hand it over to Karen Lindell from the Juvenile Law Center, who will introduce our speakers for today. Thank you.
Hi, as Megan mentioned, my name is Karen Lindell, and I'm an attorney at Juvenile Law Center, and I'd like to welcome you to the first webinar in our 8-part series on transition planning for dependent and delinquent youth with disabilities. We're hosting this series in partnership with the Support Center for Child Advocates, and each of the 8 episodes in the series will go in depth on specific transition planning topics. Today's webinar focuses on transition planning for youth with intellectual disabilities, or ID. And with me today, I have 2 fantastic expert contributors. I have Tanya Regli, who's the Executive Director of the ARC of Philadelphia, and Tanya is a leader in the disability advocacy community in Philadelphia and around the state. And her work at the ARC focuses on promoting integrated community and school-based services for children and adults with intellectual disabilities and other developmental disabilities. I'm also joined by Rachel Mann, an attorney at the Disability Rights Network of Pennsylvania, who's been advocating for the rights of children with disabilities for more than 25 years. Before we really launch into today's topic, which again is on transition planning for youth with intellectual disabilities, I'd like to provide a little bit of an overview of the series overall and to give you guys a sense of why we're dedicating an 8-part webinar series to transition planning issues for youth with disabilities. And I'm going to begin by explaining really what we mean by disability. I think that people sometimes have a preconceived idea of sort of what a person with a disability looks like or what characteristics they might have. And I want to remind people that we're really talking very broadly for purposes of this presentation as to what we mean by disability. Any physical, mental, behavioral, or developmental impairment that substantially limits one or more major life activities is considered to be a disability. And that definition is rooted in the Americans with Disabilities Act, the ADA. And when we're thinking about major life activities, that is also something that should be thought of very broadly. It includes any sort of daily basic life functions, eating, walking, sleeping, communicating, and also sort of the more any major bodily functions or systems or cognitive or learning issues are all considered to be major life activities under the ADA. And the other thing I really want to highlight at the beginning of this presentation is that we're focusing on this issue in part because it's really not a side issue for us who work in child welfare and work in the juvenile justice system. We know that youth with disabilities are overrepresented in both of those systems, and the numbers are really quite striking. What the research shows us is that of youth in foster care, 60% are receiving special education, and that's likely an underrepresentation of who actually could be entitled to receive special ed. We also know that 90% have at least one health problem. Many have multiple health issues. So this is not a minority, this is not a side issue, this is really a core fundamental thing to be aware of in practicing and having clients who are in foster care. Similarly, with justice-involved youth, research suggests that up to 70% of youth involved in the juvenile justice system meet disability criteria. And we know that youth transitioning out of both of these systems experience poor outcomes generally, but youth with disabilities, the data suggests, fare even worse than their peers. They have lower levels of educational attainment, worse self-esteem. They're less likely to be economically self-sufficient once they leave care. They're less likely to achieve permanency and have supportive adult connections that follow them into adulthood. And they're more likely to end up homeless. But the good news is that there's also research suggesting that transition services make a difference, and that good transition planning can produce better outcomes for these youth, and that it's in particular of vital importance for youth with disabilities to have strong transition planning. And this is also something that I know can sometimes be a little bit confusing as to what we mean by transition. It's a word that's used almost as a term of art in some different contexts. In the healthcare setting, it can refer to transitioning from your pediatrician, from your medical home in the pediatrics world to adulthood. It also is used in the school systems to talk about secondary transition out of the school district into adulthood. What we mean here is we're actually talking quite broadly about the transition, the preparation for a successful adulthood. And this is something that all young people go through. It's not actually really unique to systems-involved youth. We all know from our own experiences growing up and from those of us who have children, seeing them grow up, that there's a process involved in getting any young person ready to be able to succeed as an adult. So when we're referring to transition planning for purposes of this webinar, we're talking about youth who are involved in the juvenile justice system or involved in child welfare and who through those systems are seeking to be better prepared for a successful adulthood. I think that as we're throughout this webinar and throughout the series in general, it's really important to keep in mind sort of the overall framework for how we think about a successful transition. And again, thinking of it as a process, not as something that's just a discrete plan that happens as a youth is really on the verge of aging out of foster care or leaving a juvenile placement, but rather something that's ongoing, that takes months, if not years, certainly years, in fact, to prepare for. And it really begins with, as you see in that top box on the slide, an accurate diagnosis, understanding what the youth's disability is. Without having a full understanding of what the special needs are, it's impossible to be able to have the services necessary to prepare someone for adulthood. And then that obviously then moves toward appropriate services and supports being vital to preparation, high quality education, strong transition planning, and then access to post-discharge services. And I know this is all very intuitive. It might seem very common sense in some ways, but I think that as we get in the weeds a little bit on some of the more detailed elements of transition planning, it's important to keep this framework in mind as to what we mean as to the overall process and sort of what our goals are for a strong transition. And then finally, this is a big topic, which is why we're devoting an 8-part webinar series to it. And so we're not going to be able to hit every component of the process that I just outlined in each webinar. But we do have some resources available on our website. There's certainly other tools that can help you in addition to the 8 webinars that we'll be presenting. And I really encourage you to check out in particular our transition planning manual. We just released a 2nd edition. It's available on our website, www.jlc.org. And it covers all of the topics that we're about to address in sort of more depth, as well as some additional subjects. And then the planning tool that you see below there is designed to be used in tandem with the manual to help individual young people and their teams prepare for transition to adulthood. And so today we're focusing on youth with intellectual disabilities, and I'm going to turn it over to Tanya from the ARC of Philadelphia to tell us a little bit about that.
Thank you, Karen. Getting used to the cursor here. There is a tremendous over-identification of over-representation of students both in the juvenile justice system and the child welfare system. Here we have 1% of youth in the general population have an intellectual disability, so that would be the norm. And then we look here in the juvenile justice system, we suddenly have 4% of youth. And then here is another number. A study of urban area found that 13% of foster youth have an intellectual disability or an autism spectrum disorder. So that's certainly a much higher representation. And then yet another number, 25% of youth in foster care. So let's take a look at how do we know if someone has an ID diagnosis. Oops. So we have the very clear guidelines from the DSM-5 around impairment of general mental abilities. And the key here is adaptive functioning. So we're really looking at I'll give you an example. If you have a young man with autism who can read, but when you have a conversation with him, repeats everything you say back. So any question you ask, they repeat back. That's an adaptive functioning issue that would get in the way of that young person being able to do employment and other things in the community without extra support. So that would be an example of someone who, although their IQ might come in at 72, they actually have an adaptive functioning level that's lower. So the next one would be IQ of 70 or below. Pennsylvania is an ID state, meaning we base a lot of our services right now on that IQ number. So although that's not supposed to be the only thing that's taken into account when figuring out if someone qualifies for intellectual disability services, both in school and after. Unfortunately, sometimes we get a little fixated on that number. So it's important for anyone who's advocating for a child in the system who might get an IQ that's just above, who you know needs that extra support and should qualify for those extra services, that it is worth going to the mat and basically advocating for the services that someone would get with an intellectual disability. So it's very clear in the DSM-5 that it's supposed to be really a combination of things that determine whether someone has an ID diagnosis. But the reality in Pennsylvania is sometimes that does get in the way, and it really depends on us as advocates to make sure that person gets the services they need. That's something where you can also reach out to the ARC of Philadelphia or your local chapter for help with.
Or the Disability Rights Network.
Disability Rights Network.
And this is
put in plugs.
this is Rachel Mann from the Disability Rights Network. I would just add that there's some confusion in Pennsylvania about whether when you appeal, if you're entitled to a fair hearing or not with the department. Our position is you are, but you may be told otherwise, and you can contact our office about that problem. Our resource information is in a packet here, as is a case that you can cite from the Commonwealth Court saying that adaptive functioning essentially is more important than IQ.
Right. So if you run into any barriers in this regard, please reach out to either the ARC or our DRN for that extra support.
And this is Karen again from Juvenile Law Center, and I just want to highlight one example that really is this may seem sort of intuitive as, okay, you know, I go and I see if I have a client that's got an IQ test that says it's below 70, and it should be in a way, but at the same time, I know that I in my work have run into several situations, one that I want to highlight for you guys, of a young person who had a medical evaluation in her past that said that her IQ was 63. But she actually had very strong adaptive functioning in some ways, and not in all ways. But she was dynamic, she was charismatic, she didn't strike people who first met her and who didn't know a lot about working with clients with ID as someone who might have an intellectual disability. And as a result, no one really thoroughly checked to see what her medical history showed. And so it's really important to both look and see what the records already show, but also if you have any questions, and I think this actually might be the next slide, to seek evaluations.
Yeah.
And I'll let Tanya talk a little bit more
Absolutely.
about how to do that.
I did want to add that the reverse happens as well. Mm-hmm. Sometimes you have someone who's gone through their entire education having been identified with an intellectual disability, and they turn out not to have one. And the fact is that sometimes in the schools, students will or will not get certain diagnoses based on their appearance. And that is why this next step is so important, to get a really good evaluation with full-scale IQ and adaptive functioning exam is absolutely critical to those next steps. Do you want to jump in? Okay. Now, this can be done through your school. It's also important to note that if a child is found to have an IQ or adaptive functioning that would qualify for them for an intellectual disability, they should be getting reevaluated every 2 years. That's the law. And they also really need to have 3 evaluations over those 6 years in order to confirm that diagnosis of ID. So it's really important that they continue to get those reevals as well. You can also, one thing I did forget, you can also get this through the health system. Probably the most common is either through your health system. A lot of times when a child is little and has Down syndrome, they will be evaluated and determined to have ID diagnosis. And then also you can request a court order for an evaluation. IDS registration. Why do you register? So I encourage people to get a child registered as soon as they know that they have an ID diagnosis. And the reason is that there is a long waiting period. There's wait lists. You're really transitioning from the child mandated system of services to a system of services that you have to qualify for. So the wait periods, it's not an entitlement. You have to qualify for it, and it makes it a lot harder and longer to get the services in place.
And just to pause for those who don't know, IDS stands for Intellectual Disabilities Services, and it's a county-based system in Pennsylvania that provides services for individuals with intellectual disabilities, and it's not specifically for adults. In fact, it can be for any age, and that's why we're, as you'll see in this slide and the next slide, that we encourage registration as soon as you know that there is a diagnosis. And so what Tanya's getting at here is in part, for many youth that are involved in the child welfare system, there's sort of a question of, well, why do I need to register for IDS? I'm getting all the services that I need through the child welfare system or through my health insurance. And so these are just some of the many reasons why you should register, even if it's not so much that there's a service gap when you know of a diagnosis. It's a prerequisite for the adult serving systems. And so you don't want to run into any difficulty as you approach transition with wait lists, delays, eligibility questions, anything that might hinder having a smooth transition to adulthood.
Exactly. So here's just some practical information on how to get a child registered. So every county does have a slightly different system. It's really important to develop a relationship with someone at the county level. You will need certain documents, and I've certainly been a social worker long enough to know that documents oftentimes can be a barrier in themselves. So it's really important to begin collecting these so that a child can be registered. Here's your list: Social Security, birth certificate, proof of address, medical assistance, and a signed release. Also, you do need proof of the IQ testing and functional assessment.
And just a quick note that it's the responsibility for youth who are in the foster care system and child welfare, it's the responsibility of the county children and youth agency to ensure that the youth and its care are registered.
So our next slide, we have the IDS process. You have the updated or requested evaluation, the register with IDS, then they determine eligibility, and then a supports coordinator is assigned. You can actually, at least in Philadelphia, you get a choice of supports coordinators, and that's a very important thing to research, because not all supports coordinators are the same. So doing a little research on outcomes of a supports coordinator before deciding is also a really important component to this.
No, that's great.
In terms of advocacy tips, again, like I said before, it's relationship building with people in the agency is really important. It's also really important to work through the IEP process, the school district, and the secondary transition process that a school district has for that child as well. And to sometimes when you're trying to get somebody registered, it can be very difficult, and there can be a lot of barriers and challenges, and that needs to be something that you get help with. And again, that's where you reach out to DRN or your local ARP chapter to get help in getting through the process. Did you want to talk a little bit about?
I did. So just reiterate, you can call us.
For appealing denials, right? That Rachel's very interested if you're having trouble, if there's a denial and you really think that a young person should be receiving services, that they do meet the eligibility criteria, which again is just that they have the diagnosis and require active treatment. If you're getting a denial and you really think it's inappropriate, please give DRN a call. They're here to help, and their contact information is in one of the materials as a resource list, and I think they're at the very top. So, and the ARC is there too for any assistance that you need throughout the registration process. Okay, so we're now going to turn to Sam, introduce Sam here, who is a case that we're going to be working through together to sort of highlight what you should be thinking about in terms of transition planning at various ages and sort of stages in the process. And so you'll see here at the top that Sam is 14 years old at the point where we're meeting him. He has an IQ of 63 and concurrent behavioral health issues. And he is in the child welfare system. He's been in and out of the system since he was about age 8, been reunified a few times and sort of changed placements a couple times, but he's currently in a group home. And so we want to be thinking about what can we as advocates be doing to help Sam now with the transition to adulthood. And I know this might be a little counterintuitive because it seems early in some ways to be thinking of him as an adult. You know, he's only 14, but as I'm sure many of you know, 14 is becoming a very important age. It's not that we would suggest that you be thinking about transition to adulthood even earlier, but at 14, a couple things happen. First, it's the beginning of, in Pennsylvania, the secondary IEP transition planning requirement. So the school district will be starting to have transition planning be a component of the IEP process for SAM. And then now also under the Strengthening Families Act, it's the age at which services to prepare for a successful adulthood, which is sort of our independent living or our transition planning services, those are also to be provided beginning at age 14.
If I can jump in here, one of the reasons, think about that transition from middle school to high school. And it's really important to know what the interests and capabilities are of that child before they actually get to high school, especially in districts where there's choices for other high schools. So, for example, in Philadelphia, there might be a school that specializes in computer science or a school that specializes in automotive industry or a school that specializes in carpentry. And you want to make sure that that child goes to the right high school for them. And that's where the secondary transition begins, and oftentimes that's actually a little before 14, so it's important to keep that in mind. Now, if you miss that cycle, it's by no means the last chance you're going to have to do that. And so if, for whatever reason, the secondary transition process doesn't begin until they're older, always very important to take into account that child's interests and abilities.
And I would also just jump in to say that if you're finding that schools are denying admission to your students with intellectual disabilities that you think they would benefit from, you can again contact the Disability Rights Network.
And we'll talk about education a little bit. There's some more in-depth information where we'll talk about how to be figuring out what might be a good program for a young person that you're working with. And also we will have a webinar that's specifically about education issues that will go in depth on a lot of these issues about admission and entrance requirements and how to gauge what might be an appropriate program for a client you're working with. I'm just going to reiterate very quickly that you'll see that on this slide, the introduction to SAM, it does not say anywhere that he's registered with IDS. That's the first order of business. He's got an IQ of 63. He's likely eligible for services, but you've got to take that action step and begin that process even at this age, at 14. And then this will be familiar to some people, maybe not to everybody, but this is the basic components of what will become Sam's transition plan. This is when he's ultimately leaving the child welfare system or the juvenile justice system. It's required more in the child welfare system, but it's something to be thinking about just for young people in general, is what is his housing going to be? Is this someone who's going to live independently, or is this someone who's going to need to be in a supported arrangement for a long time? And we don't expect him to be able to live independently now at age 14, but we need to already be thinking about what type of living arrangement would be appropriate. Who are going to be the supportive adults that are going to follow him into adulthood that aren't caseworkers, that are people that will provide ongoing support? What will be his source of income? How will he support himself, or how can he be supported? And then any education, training, employment goals, and very importantly, how will his healthcare needs be met? So we're going to be thinking about that beginning now, and by the end of this, we will have filled in all of these. So the very first thing that I want to highlight is, this is related both to housing and to the preparation for adulthood generally, is that Sam needs family. He's in a group home right now. That's, I'm sure as many of you are aware, is not at all uncommon for youth with intellectual disabilities who are in the child welfare system. But the research shows that every child needs a family. There's no such thing as a category of child who is better off being in an institution or a group home. There's certainly a place for those placements at various times, and there may be reasons for them, but your mission as an advocate should always be, how do I make family possible for my client? And that is no less true for youth with intellectual disabilities than any other young person that you're working with. And we're running a little bit, I don't want to run us too far behind time here, so I'm going to talk about this fairly briefly, but there is a list of articles and resources that are in your materials that really shows the overwhelming evidence that restrictive placements interfere with the growth that's necessary to succeed as an adult. That when you're in a more restricted setting, you don't have access to the community in the same way. It hinders the development of the mentorship relationships with teachers or coaches or church members, neighbors, that are who really sustain young people as they leave the child serving systems and become adults. And also that the restrictive settings are really not very reflective of the way the society works or the world works, and they don't teach the important independent living skills that are necessary to succeed in adulthood. And so as an advocate, you should be thinking of residential treatment facilities, that's RTFs, and other institutional placements as treatment, as places that perhaps your clients do spend some time when they need a discrete period of treatment, but they're not placement, that every child needs a family, every child will do better with a family, and that what our role is as advocates, both for child welfare, if you're finding a placement, or in the juvenile justice setting, thinking about where is someone going to be when they're leaving a custodial setting, that figuring out how to make that be in the community family is of vital importance. And I'm just going to highlight, I'm sure many of child welfare advocates in the room know about SWAN services. That's a statewide adoption network. Not everyone might be familiar with it. But these are services that are available to help kids in foster care or in the child welfare system achieve permanency. They're adoption services and permanency services. And all of them are equally available to youth with disabilities, youth with intellectual disabilities specifically, as they are to non-disabled youth in care. So there's something that you should be thinking about for any of your clients. I want to highlight in particular one that I think is often very underutilized, which is child-specific recruitment. And this specific service is something that somewhat akin to family finding, in that what the first step is that there's a process of identifying all of the supportive connections from the young person's past and present that might be people that could be resources going forward. But it's not just thinking about placement resources. So it's a little bit different than family finding in the sense that it's not first of all, it was broader than that, but also it's seeking any type of relationship. It doesn't necessarily have to be a placement relationship, looking for mentorship connections. As we all know from our own lives, there's a lot of different types of relationships that are what help us be fulfilled adults and have the support network we need. And so this is a little bit more broad-based in its approach and is available to youth with any permanency goal and any placement type. So it doesn't have to be somebody whose goal is adoption. Even APLA, even another planned permanent living arrangement, someone who's planning to age out of the system, is eligible for this service. So it's really something to think about, and you should get in touch with your county agency or SWAN, the Statewide Adoption Network, who contracts with the county agency to find out if that service is something that could be available for you. And then Rachel's going to tell us a little bit more about other home-based.
So I'm going to talk about Medicaid, medical assistance. You've probably all heard the term EPSDT. It stands for Early Periodic Screening, Diagnosis, and Treatment. And it basically is medical assistance services for children. Children are entitled essentially to all the medical services that are necessary for them, everything that the federal government considers medical. And that includes, and this is really vital to keeping kids in their homes or having them in foster homes or in kinship homes, it includes home health services, which include both nurses, if necessary, and aides. Those services are available whenever the caretaker is not able or available to provide that service, and taking into consideration their need to work, their need to sleep, their need to take care of other people in the house, their need to go to school, or whatever responsibilities they have. It doesn't cover time to relax and watch TV, unfortunately, or take a vacation, but it does cover whatever responsibilities they have. So if you have a child with an intellectual disability who, well, if you have a child who has skilled nursing needs, then they can provide nurses during those times. If it's just an aid, for example, if a child needs some assistance with basic activities of daily living, they need some help with bathing, dressing, just meeting their general needs. You can get a home health aide, a family can get a home health aide while they're at work, and again, whenever they're not otherwise available. So And that's another area where there often are disputes about how much help is needed, and appeals are available, and there's free help available for handling appeals through legal services and the Pennsylvania Health Law Project, and our office, to the extent that they're breaking any rules in doing it. There's also behavioral health services. Behavioral health services are different. Their treatment, they sometimes require the caretaker to be around to participate in some way, but they are available for behavioral health needs. So these are really important things to make sure that families know, families who want to keep their kids at home, to make sure that foster families know, that kinship families know, etc.
And I just wanted to add a technical issue. I do recognize that there are some participants who have their hands raised. If you have your hand raised because you have a question, if you could send that through the chat box. If it's a question for the presenters, I'll be sure to save it so they can see it at the end of the training or once the training's been completed. And if it's a technical question, I can either help you answer it or redirect you to Citrix. So if you have your hand raised for a question, if you could send that through the chat box, that'd be great. Thank you.
Thanks, Megan.
There also are two special foster care programs, therapeutic foster care and medical foster care. Actually, the behavioral health system has its own therapeutic foster care system that they often call CRR host homes, but so does the department. So those are situations where the foster family has some, either in the therapeutic context, extra training to deal with behavioral issues. In the medical foster care context, it's really families that are willing to take on that extra burden that the family would otherwise take on. Because it's sometimes very difficult to find a foster family that is willing to take care of the child's needs when they are home and not working and not sleeping, if the needs are pretty constant. So medical foster care pays that family a little extra to take on those responsibilities, but that doesn't mean that they can't get the skilled nursing when they are working or whatever. So again, this is to keep kids in families.
Okay, really quickly, because we could probably spend a whole hour just on this.
And we will, in fact. Sorry, I'm going to plug
That's right,
later.
plug
We were doing an education-specific webinar later in the series. We'll send out dates. You'll all get the information about it. So we will go in depth on all of this, but Tanya's going to hit the high points here.
Okay. My general rule of thumb is that wherever possible, a child should be where their neighborhood peers are. And so your community schools are always the best bet. I've been doing this for 20 years, and when a child is placed out of their local school, there's always things they lose out on. It's always the best. Also, it's really important, especially once children become youth, that they are directing things, that we are basing this on what they are saying, what their interests are, and we all know that if you don't have the youth's buy-in, it's not going to happen. So save some time, include them from the beginning in all conversations and decision-making, and even have them lead some of those conversations and decision-making. Things do indeed have to be individualized. They have to be based on that person's interests and skills, what their strengths are. And I can't emphasize enough the importance of a strong secondary transition plan, which you can be a really important part of.
And this, as advocates, especially those who are involved, who are professionals within the foster care system or the juvenile justice system, one thing that you can do as someone outside of the school system that's vitally important to your client's education is make sure that the young person has an active education decision maker. The EDM is the person who makes decisions about where the student will attend the school, where they will attend school, the content of the IEP, discipline decisions, and many other issues. And so many times we find that youth in care, they may have somebody listed as their EDM that's not actually playing that active role, or they may not have an EDM. And so if you find that to be the case, as an advocate, what you can do is, first of all, identify that situation, try to locate someone who could serve as the education decision maker, someone who knows the young person or has a good relationship with them, that could have that kind of empowering relationship that Tanya was mentioning, where the youth is able to be an active part of that process, that they trust the person that they're the potential EDM, and then you can advocate to the court. You have to ask the court to appoint that person as the education decision maker. And notably, a caseworker cannot be that person for someone who's receiving special education. It cannot be a public or a private caseworker, and if the caseworker is signing a child's IEP, that IEP is not valid. So it needs to be somebody who's outside of the system, but that can have an ongoing relationship with the young person.
Okay, so here is probably a familiar list at this point, but something very important to look at, the working papers. So when youth in high school start working, youth with intellectual disabilities should also start working, so that's really important. Interest assessments can be incredibly helpful. You don't just do it once, you keep revisiting people's interests. We grow and change.
Can you really briefly explain what an interest assessment is for people that aren't as familiar?
So interest assessment, VOTEC schools actually often do really have standard interest assessments. It's basically trying to figure out or help that student figure out what they like, what they're interested in, what area they are most drawn to. It's a standardized assessment. Now, there are some students who maybe are nonverbal where you need to do a slightly different interest assessment. The discovery assessment process is a good example where really, and this actually is good for anybody, but it's absolutely necessary for someone who may have trouble communicating what their interests are, is it takes the whole team, the family, everyone, friends, anyone who's connected to that person to come together and to talk about and think about, okay, what have I seen that this person is interested in? How have they communicated their interests? So it's a slightly different way of doing it. And then tech schools, again, tech schools have to include all students, including students with disabilities. So if you're encountering any issues with VOTEC schools and accessibility for a student who has a particular interest in that field, contact DRN. Okay, so here's a video we thought we'd throw in for fun. Give us a moment while we go to the YouTube. And it's not specifically intellectual disability related, but it does really communicate. Yeah, go ahead.
They told me it couldn't be done. After lost cause, I was picked on and picked last. Coaches didn't know how to talk to me. They gave up on me. Told me I should just quit. They didn't call my name. Told me it was over. But I've been deaf since I was 3. So I didn't listen. And now I'm with a lot of fans in the NFL cheering me on. And I can hear them all.
Okay, so an inspiring story. We're not sponsored by Duracell, but it is one of those stories that helps us think about just how much we can do and the youth that we're working with can do in their lives.
So now we're fast forwarding a little bit. This was all just to give you guys the framework here. You know, we were thinking about Sam at age 14. Now we're fast forwarding a little bit to Sam at 17. He ages very well. He has not changed much since 3 years ago. But he's currently living in a therapeutic foster placement. So he's in a family-based setting. He's been registered with IDS. He's now in 11th grade and he's running on the track team. And he's in his community school. And his behavioral issues have had some improvement with wraparound services. That he is both through the therapeutic foster placement, he's been receiving more specialized treatment, and then also additional services through his health insurance. And through the interest assessments and just the process of being in school and getting to know people in this community, you know, he's really discovered that he loves being outside, loves working with his hands, has a lot of interest in that area, and has had some strong teachers and mentors who have been cultivating that interest of his. And so we're going to, again, think about where we are in the planning process. So this is the same transition plan we were looking at the beginning, but we have some things that we're starting to fill in here. We know in terms of supportive adult connections that his foster parent and the track coach are both people who are strong supports right now, and that should be continue to be encouraged as he's getting older. That he's, because of the relationship he has with teachers at school, his interest, his desire to work outside, his interest in the outdoors in general is, you know, he's tentatively has a goal of looking at a certificate program in landscaping, or potentially working in landscaping or in horticulture, maybe working for a nursery. So these might change. We're not saying that this is locked in stone at this point, but it's great to be thinking of this stuff in concrete terms at this point in Sam's planning process. Obviously, we still have other issues that we need to be addressing as we're getting closer to transition, you know, where he's going to live, what his income will be, what his healthcare, how his healthcare needs will be met. And now Tanya's going to talk a little bit about independent living skills. I want to note for a minute that we're not suggesting that this only needs to be thought of at age 17. We're just as it's a part of the planning process throughout the whole, you know, at 14, at 15, and as the youth gets older. But we're highlighting it here at this part of the presentation as the young person's 17 or so.
Right, so there are actually increasingly so many awesome options for students with intellectual disabilities. Sometimes it's actually the simple things that get in the way, things like transportation. Travel training, I can't even emphasize how important that is. But there's also things like, okay, if they're going to be working, helping them learn how to manage their money. Helping them think about the community approach and their holistic life. So they're going to need to go to the doctor just like everybody else. They're going to need to go to the bank and figure out how to pay bills. And these are all things that it's important to think through. And we have this opportunity during school, while they're still in school, to get some of these trainings and services. So it can be a really exciting time. And then there's also, during that 18 to, we got that later, there's also programs off-site that they might want to participate in.
Did you want to talk about some of the work experiences with?
Oh, was it? Sorry, got confused. So, yeah, job shadowing. We like to. I like to see somebody get to go and experience different jobs. All of us get to do that in some way, shape, or form a lot of times. I know when I did babysitting, I decided that I was not going into early child education. So there's different things, experiences, really developmentally work and volunteer and internships and are just incredibly key to helping you decide what you do want to do. It's not like we wake up one day knowing what we want to do. We get there through a process. We need to make sure that our students with intellectual disabilities also get to go through that experience of trying different things out.
And just a very important step at this, you can see on the bottom of your slide, referring the youth to the Office of Vocational Rehabilitation, or OVR, just an incredibly vital resource to help both assessment and getting these types of job experiences that are really necessary to be able to succeed in employment in adulthood.
So getting most high schools have, at least in Philadelphia, have an OVR there, officer working there. It's really important to get them connected and registered with OVR. If they're not there, then you need to make an appointment with the regional office and get them registered with OVR. This is absolutely vital, and the students definitely should qualify to get registered.
Just really briefly, and we'll talk about this much more in the education presentation, But as we've mentioned before, students receiving special education can remain in school until they're 21, and that is a really valuable source of services, that it allows you to continue to receive special education services, and if you graduate, you lose that entitlement.
Right. So I have often come across the issue where you have an 18 or 19-year-old who suddenly wants to graduate with their peers and go to the prom, and you do not have to go actually get your diploma to do that. You can walk with everybody else and get a certificate instead of a diploma. And you can go to all of the senior activities. 18 to 21 in best practice looks very different than the high school experience. It should reflect and mirror what peers are doing. So if their peers are in college or in a VOTEC program, they should be in those programs as well. If peers are in jobs and working, they should be doing that as well with the support of the school.
And then,
so, and this is Rachel again. Remember, once youth are 18, they're adults, and we want to honor as much as possible their ability to make decisions for themselves. There are options short of guardianship, including, in appropriate cases, a power of attorney or a healthcare representative. For information about that, our website at www.drnpa.org has extensive materials on substitute decision making and videos about substitute decision making that could be very helpful to figuring out what to do in that respect.
all right, so we're going to fast forward, and we're going to fast forward especially quickly since we're running short of time, to approaching discharge. And you'll see that at the top of the slide I have it as an 18 to 21 window, because once a youth is 18, you don't know necessarily when they're going to discharge. They're adults, as Rachel just mentioned. And so really thinking of it as, we have somebody who anticipates staying in care till 21, but they may not. And so, be thinking about approaching discharge could be really kind of at any moment once somebody's 18. So Sam's still in therapeutic foster placement, really stable setting at this point. He's preparing to graduate. He's been connected to OBR. And that interest in working outdoors has really sort of solidified into an interest in working in landscaping or gardening. So we're now thinking, though, about discharge, about leaving the child serving systems. And so there's some really important changes that happen at age 21. And several services that are entitlements or that are available for children that are not available for adults. And the first is the EPSDT mandate that Rachel had mentioned earlier, that all medically necessary services be provided. That ends. Medicaid itself doesn't end. You can still be on Medicaid, but the array of services provided becomes more restrictive than it was for individuals who are under 21. Special education services, you can receive them through age 21, but once you either graduate from high school or reach the school year in which you turn 21, that's the limit to when you'll have an IEP. So, colleges, vocational schools that are post-secondary don't offer IEPs. And of course, child welfare services end and the court oversight ends. So a lot of supports that were in place for SAM previously are going to be going away. There are things that continue, and they've all, other than waivers, which we're going to talk about in depth in a minute, they're all things that we've talked about here. The Intellectual Disability Services, Office of Vocational Rehabilitation, Medicaid, and then Medicaid Waivers, which Rachel will get into, and SSI, which we will mention SSI briefly, Supplemental Security Income, very valuable source of cash assistance. We're going to do an entire webinar on it, and it's actually the next one coming up in the series. It'll be in late January. So I want to flag that here as a really valuable resource that continues into adulthood, but we're not going to go in depth on it in this presentation.
So waivers are a situation where the federal government waived certain rules for states so that they could provide services that they wouldn't otherwise be able to provide, but they don't have to provide them to everybody. And the purpose is to avoid institutionalization. So they provide services to people with intellectual disabilities in the community so that they don't have to be institutionalized. They're incredibly helpful, but there is a long waiting list for those waivers in Pennsylvania in the ID system. Another reason you want to get registered early, eligibility is based on need. Kids who are aging out of child welfare are likely to have very high needs because they don't have families that are going to be able to pick up the slack. So they should be a very high priority for getting into one of the two waivers that the ID system has. The consolidated waiver is the big one, and it provides housing, the whole community living arrangement, habilitation services, education and employment support, supports coordination, services beyond Medicaid. If you can get your individual you're dealing with into that waiver, that's going to provide for them very well for a very long time, the rest of their lives perhaps. If not, there's a smaller waiver, the person family-directed service waiver that provides up to $30,000 per year of services, which may or may not be enough for a particular individual.
Do you want to talk about life share, what a life share is?
Yeah, I missed a page there. Okay. Life share is a service that's available in the consolidated waiver where an individual, it's like a foster home in the adult world. An individual lives with a family that's paid to take them in, and they're part of the family. And a foster care provider could become a life share provider so that a child could stay in the same, a young adult could stay in the same family that they've been in all along, which would be wonderful if they're happy with that family. They have to get the waiver, the family has to agree to enroll and so forth, but it's a really good option if it's available. Other homes tend to be small group homes in the community, 2- and 3-person usually homes in the community.
This is Karen. I just want to note that we have seen this work successfully for a number of our clients, where a foster provider has had a long-term relationship with the client, with the young person, and agrees to become a life share provider. And if you plan early enough, there can be a streamlined transition of services. What unfortunately we've seen in a number of cases is there's a gap, and so you end up sort of depending on the foster parent being able and willing to continue to support the young person without the support of the ID system and waiver. So that's another. What you can do as an advocate is make sure they're registered early and make sure you're talking to the supports coordinator.
Yes, and if there's any chance that the child's going to end up on the street, you want to make sure that the supports coordinator is well aware that this is an emergency case. And then they will develop an individual support plan, which initially, when you're still involved with the child, would be able to participate in. But any questions you have about that, feel free to call our office.
There's also in your materials, there's a sort of cheat sheet on the waivers overall. There's a lot more beyond the two that we're featuring here that are through the ID system that have different eligibility criteria. So each of the different waiver programs has a different set of eligibility criteria and also a different array of services that are offered. They can get a little complicated, so absolutely call DRN if you have any questions. But there is a sheet in your materials that has kind of the bare bones information about each of them. And then I'm going to mention just very briefly, as I said, that SSI has got to be something that you're thinking about in the transition planning process. It's cash assistance for individuals who have a disability and also who have very low income. It's not only a really important resource in terms of the cash assistance it provides, but it also has some housing possibilities associated with it through what's called the domiciliary care program, which we'll talk about in much more depth in the SSI webinar. And it also provides automatic Medicaid eligibility. The key thing to know as advocates is that you've got to start getting the records and evaluations early because not only does the application process take a little while, but if you apply and then there's sort of insufficient medical evidence, that will set you back and take even longer. And so what you can be doing, what our action step for advocates, both for juvenile justice professionals and for child welfare workers, is to begin the process of at least thinking about the SSI application, collecting the needed information, knowing where you're going to get it at least a year before the expected discharge. There are some limits as to when you can actually submit the application for youth who are Title IV-E eligible, so certain youth in foster care might not be able to apply until sort of 3 months out from when they're leaving care, but you can do all of the background work to get a complete application in the works before then. All right, so we've reached the very end here, and I apologize that we unfortunately have eaten into our time for questions, but we will respond to questions. We'll be able to respond by email to people's individual questions. We're more than happy to do that. But I just wanted to show that here at the end, having planned for Sam's transition beginning at age 14, we now have a full transition plan. He was in a therapeutic foster placement for a long time. He was registered with IDS. He's on the waiver, the consolidated waiver, which means that he has a life share. He can have a life share arrangement funded through his waiver and stay in the same placement while he still needs to, while he's sort of unable to live on his own or still interested in living with a family. He has supportive adults in his life. He's receiving SSI, and he has begun an internship to sort of cultivate the job skills so that eventually he might be able to work in the community and earn a wage as well. And so he's got post-secondary goals and has a concrete employment plan, and his health needs are being met. So this is really the ideal that we'd like to see at the end of the planning process.
All right, so thank you to all of our speakers today, and thank you for everyone for staying on and participating in the webinar. As a reminder, I know that there were some questions that came in, particularly questions regarding the materials, and I realize that some of you might not have access to the materials tab, so those will go out to you in a post-training email. I will also send the PowerPoint slides as well as the link to the evaluation. And so I guess, again, I would like to thank everyone for participating today. I'd like to thank our speakers. And we will also be sending out information regarding the next webinar in the series once we have the date finalized. We do know it will be toward the end of January, but once we have that date finalized, we will send you the information and the registration link, and we hope that you will all be able to join us. All right, thank you again, and we look forward to seeing you soon. Bye.